Before we begin, I want to take a moment to welcome our new listeners, courtesy of Megan Daum's great podcast, The Unspeakable. Megan has described me as, quote, being in the free-thinking heterodox space, end quote. And I think that's a fair assessment. I'm wary of the dangers of conformity, and I'm drawn to those who are willing to think differently and critically, like the two women I'm speaking with today, who have themselves been guests on The Unspeakable. I enjoy conversations with people who have unique perspectives on and novel approaches to topics ranging from the cutthroat Silicon Valley space race to the contested origins of COVID-19 to the global conflict over increasingly critical minerals like lithium and cobalt. The show is called Where We Go Next because we're going somewhere new all the time. And on that note, let's start the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And the art and format of storytelling is undergoing a profound transformation. As traditional media loses its grip on our attention and short-form, shallower social media posts fill the void. Our two guests this week are writers who are adapting their craft to this new landscape, mining their personal experiences to illuminate and reflect on some of the most important social and political issues of the day. Nancy Rommelmann is an investigative journalist, columnist, and author, most recently of To the Bridge, a true story of motherhood and murder. Sarah Hepola is the author of the best-selling memoir, Blackout, Remembering the Things I Drank to Forget, and a staff writer at the Dallas Morning News. Together, they host the Smoke 'em If You Got 'em podcast. Nancy, Sarah, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I'm glad that it's a pleasure all around. Now, it's nice to talk with both of you together. Both of you have been guests on this podcast, but separately, this is your first time as a duo, as co-hosts of the Smoke 'em If You Got 'em podcast. Listening back to the first episode of Smoke 'em If You Got 'em, it doesn't really feel like the first episode of the show. I mean, it's a great conversation, but it feels more like, Nancy, that you're interviewing Sarah, not necessarily a conversation between two co-hosts. In fact, it wasn't until episode 5 of the show that it really got its proper theme music. So when did you both realize that this was going to be more than a few conversations recorded between two writers on their path to becoming friends? When did you realize it was a proper podcast? Nancy, we can start with you.
Well, you are correct, Michael. The first episode was me interviewing Sarah. We did not have any plans to do a podcast together. And we had such a good time talking. And I think we felt as though we hadn't finished what we wanted to talk about. So we did it again. And I think it was the third episode when we were recording or just after, I thought, I think we have a podcast here. Is that how you remember it, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it has a lot of parallels with dating where you meet somebody and you're like, well, they're interesting. I'd like to get to know them. And you've gone on maybe like 1,000 dates. I had done so many podcasts at that point. And I did a podcast with Nancy and I just really liked it. I remember, I'm sure this is hyperbolic, but like, I remember that like at the end of the hour, it was like we hadn't gotten to her questions yet. It was like, oh, you got to come back on because we have like a million more questions. And then my mother, who listens to a lot of my podcasts, listened to it and she was like, I really liked that conversation you had with that woman, that lady, that lady Nancy. And I was like, I know, me too. And it was like I found myself thinking about it. It has a lot of corollaries with dating because there's just certain times when you click. And it's almost like we clicked without really ever saying it. And at some point, I think it was around our 3rd or 4th episode together, she called me and was basically like, do you want to go steady?
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, I had been looking for someone to do a podcast with, and I could never find quite the right partner. It's a tricky thing. And this was just somebody that I felt like, even though we had just met, which was so strange, it felt like we had known each other a long time and that we worked together in that kind of necessary way. We had a groove.
There's something about the way your mom said, I like the conversation you had with that woman. I'd just be like, I did have a podcast with that woman.
Totally.
Nancy Rommelmann. I had a similar experience with Jay Shapiro, a brilliant writer and podcaster in his own right. And after we recorded our first episode together, God, it was like 2+ hours. My dad is probably my biggest fan of everything I do. And so he listens to every episode of my podcast right when it releases at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday morning.
Oh.
And he texts me that day, the day of the first episode I recorded with Jay. I think we've done 5 now. But at the time, he was like, it just sounded like a conversation between 2 old friends.
Yeah.
And it is interesting, right? Like how you can have those conversations with someone you've really just met, and it feels like you've known them forever.
What was also cool about that is that Nancy and I were meeting and discovering each other on the podcast. Now I've known her for 2 years, so I can maybe prompt her to tell an old story or something. But we were like actually literally getting to know each other.
Yeah.
And so there was a sense of discovery. So I think when you have both intimacy of conversation, but also discovery of newness, that's a really cool, special thing. And my mom used to tell me, it just sounds like I'm getting to listen to 2 people having this really interesting conversation. My mom is new to podcasts, so she doesn't know that that's basically what all of them should be. She thinks it's just something her daughter cooked up on her own with that lady, Nancy Rommelmann. But I do think that the podcast space is also really dominated by men.
Guilty.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to say anything, but...
Your podcast has a theme song, Girls Talk by Dave Edmonds. And it has, I suppose, the rather appropriate refrain, considering the song title, quote, I just want to hear girls talk. So maybe we can relate this to the point you just made, Sarah. How do girls talk? How do they talk to each other? How is it different from how men talk to one another? And does that play a part in why the podcast industry is more dominated by men? Is it something structural? What's going on there?
Well, the one thing that has been a riddle to me is that men traditionally say that they don't like talking in relationships. And yet I'm like, why the hell are you all on podcasts? And someone explained to me, no, they just don't like listening. They want to broadcast, like it's the classic mansplainer's medium, and I say that with love and also as somebody that doesn't particularly like the term mansplaining. Actually, I just love being mansplained too. I grew up with an older brother, so I'm like, mansplain me. I think women are far more sensitive about pleasing the audience and not offending people. I think that men are a little tougher about this. Now, Nancy's going to have a different perspective on this because she's like spiritually male. I am very spiritually female. And so the idea that I can't see the audience, I can't see who I'm offending, I might make people mad. Like, especially in the early days, I would finish the podcast and be like, oh my God, who did I offend? Almost like I gave an Oscar speech and forgot to mention people. And Michael, you and I have talked about this because I think we both share this kind of neurotic doublethink.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Of like, oh my God, what have I done? What have I said? And I think that's just a lot harder for women, whereas the men that I know are like, I don't care. Like, it's just me talking. And I just think that women are a lot more reluctant to put themselves out there. But I'd be curious to hear what Nancy thinks about this.
So I think the thing with dudes talking is dudes do like to talk. They like to talk about topics, right? It's going to be fishing. It's going to be cars. It's going to be politics. It's going to be whatever they like, harmonicas. I don't know, something, right? Or, oh, did you see this movie? Yeah. And I know that. And I knew this. And they can just continually spool out a conversation. And that's why it can go so long, because that's how their brains operate more than women who like to talk about feelings and what happened with so-and-so. I heard something the other day. It was just so completely true. This guy's like, yeah, so anyway, I went fishing for 20 hours with this friend of mine, and I came home, and my wife's like, so what's going on with him and his ex-wife? And the dude's like, I don't know. And she's like, how do you not know? You were with him for 20 hours. He's like, it wouldn't occur to me to ask him that. So I have no idea, because I don't listen to a ton of podcasts that are hosted by women, but I would imagine that some of them are a little more like talking about how things are feeling. That is not something I don't think we do a whole lot of, Sarah.
Well, I just want to say, not my Nancy. Nancy's not going to let me get away with like, how are we feeling today? I'm a feeling MFer. Like, I was raised by a therapist. I want to talk about my feelings till the sun comes up. And my Nancy is not going to have it. Early on, we did a podcast where I talked a lot about my ex-boyfriend, and she was like, I think nobody really cares about your ex-boyfriend. And I was like, okay.
Well, don't pull your punches, Nancy. Come on.
Look, we definitely do talk about that. We've talked about the fact that, my mother is ill. We've talked about some relationship stuff, and we get into some sensitive stuff. And I've certainly cried a bit on the podcast, mostly about journalism.
It's true.
It's true. I get very head up about journalism, but I guess it is the case that there are more male podcasters. I don't really think about that. I do wonder who listens to podcasts? Like, who's listening to these 5-hour podcasts? Is it mostly men, or is it mostly women, or is it equal? Does anyone here know the answer to that question?
Well, when you say 5-hour podcasts, I immediately think about things like the 4-hour podcast that Joe Rogan just put out, where Terrence Howard and Eric Weinstein were talking to each other. I mean, for 4 literal hours. I think that's a largely dude podcast. And I think that people listen while they're at work. I think they listen while they're working out. I think they listen while they're doing their job. So it becomes a kind of background noise, almost like a podcast analog to sports radio, which here in Dallas is very big, and people do that too. It's just the sound of people in the background talking, and you can kind of dip in and out of it as you need to. It's not like something that you have to stay locked in on, like it's Serial or something. Serial meaning Serial.
Right. But that would then require that you had a job that you could do that. And maybe those jobs are more inhabited by men than by women.
Yeah, I think so. But also, women love those true crime podcasts.
Oh, yes, they do. Oh, yes, they do. They're also a little more bite-sized.
Yes.
So you can listen while you make a dinner or while you drive someplace, as opposed to like 7 hours if you're working on your car.
Yeah. I think there's one other thing at play, speaking as a man myself. I think one other thing is at play in terms of the broad differences between how men and women talk. Obviously, to be sure, to crib a phrase from Megan Down, to be sure, there is a lot of overlap between how men and women talk. But one thing that I've noticed is, and speaking as someone who loves having in-depth, often personal conversations off mic with my friends, like I can just say to a friend, like, hey, you want to grab a beer and let's just talk about our feelings. I have no problem with that. But being an observer of men as well, one thing I've noticed is men really enjoy talking if they're doing something else while they're talking. So with my group of friends anyway, they'll get together a group to play board games, or they'll get together a group to play, video games or something, or it could be darts or whatever it is. And they'll have hours-long conversations, but the conversation is paired with the quote-unquote main activity, which is a physical thing, and then the conversation happens while that other thing is happening. It's more rare, I think, for men broadly to get around just to talk, but they have no problem yapping until the cows come home if they're doing something else while they're talking.
Right, or if there's music playing in the background and they can also talk about the music.
Right.
Realizing too that Nancy and I kind of balance each other out in terms of, I really like to talk about more emotional things. She really keeps us on topics. And, we've been speaking in broad generalizations about the sexes, but of course, there are plenty of men that want to talk about feelings. There are plenty of women that want to talk about topics. And I think one of the things that Nancy and I do is balance each other out so that we stay a little bit more between both of those things. Our audience is about 50-50. And I think that is a little bit unusual.
That's rare. I mean, it's more common to have audiences that are overwhelmingly male or overwhelmingly female. It's very difficult to get a 50-50 split like that. What do you think that's attributed to?
Nancy's OnlyFans page.
Yeah, my OnlyPans page where I bake.
OnlyPans page.
It's funny. I've noticed as a journalist, I always sort of think that I have more male readers than female readers, but it could just also be that the men are the ones that are making comments, so you don't really know. But I think it is true that we have a pretty good split because we're talking about things that are in the culture right now and that interest us. And we're, not particularly ebbing on the feeling thing or just the topic thing. And then, I don't know, just maybe it's appealing. I don't know.
Well, Nancy, you used to largely write for Reason, which is, I would have to imagine, it's a libertarian publication, and I would imagine it's largely male. I know there are prominent women that write there, but...
Wait, the Libertarian Party is largely male? I mean, just looking at the Libertarian Convention, that's not what I see at all.
Some of these events, it's like 9-1.
9.9 to 1.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know that much, so you guys...
I'm joking.
I know you're joking, but for a second I was like, I don't know. And I come from the memoir space where my audience was like 90% female. So usually if somebody says like, oh, I followed Sarah over to this podcast, it's going to be a woman. And if it's somebody that said, oh, I followed Nancy over to this podcast, it's going to be a dude. So part of it is our audiences that we brought to this. But then I think also it's having that sweet spot between intellectual discourse, but also joking around. We laugh a lot. I think humor is really important, even when you're talking about serious things. Your original question was, what is it like when girls talk together? I mean, I think an episode that I would point you toward that men would never have is the episode we did on abortion, which was shortly after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I told Nancy about my abortion for the first time. I mean, I don't think I had told her that story. And I had never told that story on a public forum before. And it's intense. I mean, I think I cry and, she may have cried. I mean, it was all the feels, but they were very authentic. And I heard from men after that who said, I have never heard anyone talk about their abortion in that way, because the accepted public performance is either I had an abortion and I don't regret it, or I had an abortion and it ruined my life. And I was somewhere in the vast gray area in between, which is what I think most people who go through any kind of complicated ordeal about which they have emotional ambivalence, that's where they're going to land. And for us to be able to do that on a podcast, I think it was a really rare, special thing that we were able to do at a time when there was just a lot of noise in the culture, pro or con. And this wasn't really about either. It was just about what it is in a human life.
That circles back to something we just talked about, which is the different ways that men and women will have conversations. I think stereotypically men will have conversations while doing other things. And I think that men have a lot of conversations about abortion while writing legislation. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll say is that most of the guys that I know, they never talk about abortion.
No.
Even if they have been both schooled and trained, and they don't even believe that they have...
They clam up.
They clam up, and they've also don't believe that they have a right to have an opinion about it, depending on where they lie on the political spectrum. And that is sort of baffling to me. I think that the feminist discourse has tried to have it both ways, which is you don't get to have a say about abortion, but you need to pay for a child if one comes into the world. So in other words, you don't have a say and you are half responsible. And I should say the more strident feminist discourse, I don't mean to throw shade against all feminist discourse. I just happen to hear often that we're not interested in men's opinions on this. And, I think there's also a perception that men are the ones who are pro-life. Being in Texas here, I happen to know that a huge number of women are pro-life, that the pro-life movement is led by women. Men may be the ones doing the legislation, but the moral ambiguity at the heart of abortion, if you dig into it, there's a reason why it's been one of the most fraught conversations in American life for the last 50 years.
Not to go too far afield here, but I think one of the reasons why people on the left tend to get that statistic wrong, believing that most people who oppose abortion are male, is because they misattribute the motivations behind a lot of pro-lifers not wanting abortion, which, having Christian family members and a lot of conservative folks within my family, you take 10 minutes to talk to them about their reasons for not supporting abortion. And I'm sure there are people out there, but I've never really heard anyone talk about controlling women's bodies. It comes from usually a deeply held religious belief around what they perceive as the sanctity of life. And it's one of those things where once you get to talk to someone in that way, you're like, oh yeah, of course there are a lot of women that also believe this, because there are a lot of women who are Christian or who are religious. And I think that really speaks to a larger problem within our culture right now, which I want to delve into with both of you, which is our inability to sort of talk about these quote unquote controversial topics in really nuanced and honest ways. And I think that gets us to the larger topic of what the Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em podcast is and how it kind of came to be and how both of you got here. The podcast is many things, but I think one of those things is a frank conversation about quote unquote culture war issues. Those subjects that are declared taboo by wider society, things like race, sex, gender, consent, those light topics that you two have such fun with. But this is a podcast that couldn't have existed only a few years ago, as it would have been missing a co-host. There's an essay you wrote for The Atlantic, Sarah, published in March of 2022 called The Things I'm Afraid to Write About, in which you talk about your past struggles speaking up about controversial, quote unquote, controversial topics that you care deeply about. And the essay largely covers the span of 2018 to 2022. In it, you write, quote, I was not writing much about this stuff, except in the journals where I always stowed my secrets. Every once in a while, I'd get a head of steam about some scandal, and I'd start a big swing essay only to bench myself a few days later, end quote. And later in the essay, you write, quote, at my core, I was a people pleaser, and the culture had reached a moment when any opinion worthy of expression ran the risk of losing half your audience, end quote. My question is, what changed?
I mean, I went broke. I was a freelance writer who wasn't writing. And so that'll get you to a pretty desperate place. And I grew tired enough that I wasn't scared anymore. I mean, I was in such a writer's block. I mean, for like the better part of a year. It's almost like I've forgotten that time, and it coincides with the pandemic. And it's just like this blur of time and pain and being kind of trapped inside my own mind or heart, not really knowing who my friends were, because all of a sudden politics had spilled over into friendships in this weird way. And I felt so alienated. I was getting very connected to a lot of the podcasts that I was listening to, including The Fifth Column, which is kind of the way that Nancy and I met, which I'll get to in a second. But The Fifth Column is three guys that are journalists and journalist adjacent, and they're straight shooters. And I felt like I had come home, you know, that people were talking to me. Of course, in real life, I wasn't talking to them at all. They didn't know who the hell I was. But listening to them gave me courage to start talking about what I thought mattered. I mean, Megan Daum is another person that gave me courage. She's a friend in real life, and we would go to dinner sometimes. And, you know, I'm in AA, and, you know, you have a sponsor in AA that kind of helps walk you through the steps. And Megan joked that she was going to be like my free speech sponsor, you know, and like help me learn to put on your big girl pants and take the hits. And she was a huge help in that capacity. And I had some other friends working behind the scenes that were like, do it, you know, and because they are a little more corseted because of their own day jobs, maybe. So I wrote this story called The Things I'm Afraid to Write About. I wrote it really fast. That's always a sign for me that A, I'm ready to write it, and B, that I've been working on it unconsciously for a long, long time. And when it went up in the Atlantic, I was very scared that I was going to be enemy number one on Twitter. It reminds me so much of being a little kid in middle school, afraid to get picked on. So I wouldn't do anything. Like I wouldn't try out for the sports. I wouldn't go to the dances. I was so afraid to get picked on that I did nothing. I just stayed in my house. And it's a very similar feeling. I was just afraid that I was going to be enemy number one on Twitter. So, but the Atlantic story did well enough that I did become enemy number one on Twitter. And what I learned, which I was so grateful to learn, was that it really is not a big deal. It lasts a few days, it stings, you learn some things, and people move on. And it's incredibly scary while you're inside it. Now, I didn't have one of these kerfuffles where like people were trying to get me fired or dox me or anything like that. So mine was a relatively minor engagement. But I definitely had a huge number of strangers coming at me and telling me I was a bad person, you know, a rape apologist, and bizarrely to my thinking, a transphobe, since the article wasn't even remotely about gender. But I had said a few things that ended up being dog whistles. Somebody called them dog whistles I didn't know I was holding. But, you know, I sent that article to The Fifth Column and told them, I hope this is the craziest thing anybody's done to get on your show. And that was shared with Nancy, who then called me. And I was really a mess that day. I was at a vintage store shopping, trying to get my head out of the fact that people I knew and thought were friends of mine were turning on me on social media. And Nancy called me. And, you know, it's like when you have an experience with something, like, say you got a bad scrape on your knee, and then somebody shows up and they're like, listen, kid, I've had an amputation. And that was Nancy. And she was so kind, funny, and encouraging. I could just tell like the next chapter of my life had started. It's really rare to have that kind of profound experience in the moment, but I did.
Nancy, Sarah's essay starts, I suppose, in 2018. That's when the first few passages of the essay take place. And in 2018, speaking of having a leg amputated, you were co-hosting the #MeNeither podcast with Leah McSweeney, started in December 2018, about the nuances of the Me Too movement. And I suppose more specifically, its hypocrisies and excesses. Have you always felt comfortable sticking your head above the social parapet? Or was there, similar to Sarah, a breaking point somewhere along the way when keeping silent became worse than the potential repercussions of speaking out?
Well, the answer to that is I never really considered it sticking my head above the parapet. I grew up in New York City. People usually tell you what they think. Sarah was mentioning that I write a lot for Reason, but I wrote for 20 years for the LA Weekly as a freelancer, but I wrote about 200 pieces for them. And, you know, you're writing about all kinds of things, you know, cops and hookers and drugs and relationships and killers and or whatever's interesting in the town. And I never felt like there was something I wasn't allowed to write about. I've never felt that in my life. If I'm curious about it and I can do my job well and with some honor with the people I'm writing about and try to really look into a subject, it's fine. Like I've never considered anything verboten. When I started doing the #MeNeither podcast with Leah McSweeney, we met because we both were noticing some of these crazy excesses within the Me Too movement, especially this actress Asia Argento, who'd been Anthony Bourdain's girlfriend. It's a long story. It's too long to tell here, but we were both writing about it. I was writing about it for Reason. She was writing about it for, I think she was at Playgirl at the time. We just thought, we understand that people are super stoked that, some pretty bad dudes are getting their comeuppance, but we have to also have due diligence and due process. These are human beings and lives you're talking about. So I never considered it to be strange or even edgy or whatever to talk about this stuff. It just felt normal. But I will tell you that at the time when I started it, I had a really dear friend and she said to me, "You're going to get in trouble for this." And I truly didn't understand. This is a brave gal. She's a novelist and nonfiction writer. And I didn't even know what she was talking about. It turned out she was correct, but I still don't. Okay, how do I put this? The reason it got me in trouble was not because we were talking about things we shouldn't be talking about. The reason it got me in trouble is because someone understood that maybe a large part of the country or whatever humanity is afraid to sort of talk about this and that they could use someone talking about it as sort of an instrument to get what they wanted. And what they wanted was, they wanted to hurt my husband and me. So it's not really that the talking about it is the problem. It's that other people see how they can craft it to use it against others, if that makes sense. So in any case, I've never been afraid, I don't think I ever will be, to talk about anything. I know that people will say like, "Oh, you guys talk about things with so much nuance." I'm just like, yeah, that's great. I think it's just having a conversation. And I think that actually is, to kind of circle back to what you were saying about who's the audience. I think people might not be used to hearing that. I consider the conversation Sarah and I have to be perfectly normal. I have these conversations with my friends all the time. Of course, I do hang out with a lot of journalists, but I would hate to be thought of as someone who's like, "Oh, you're so courageous to talk about these subjects." It's like, no, it's normal, or it feels normal to me. But you also are correct, Michael, that it was a little early, I guess, in 2018 to have these conversations, these sort of third rail issues, because I've told Sarah more than once, dude, the conversation we're having right now is the conversation I had in 2018. Not exactly, of course, but people are more ready and hungry to listen to it now.
I want to say something about that early podcast that Nancy did with Leah McSweeney, who then, went on to be on The Real Housewives of New York and have her own different career. And Nancy went on to the greatness of podcasting with me. But if you go back and you look at what they were saying in 2018, which, you can't because it's offline, but everything they're talking about turns out to be vindicated by press and changing mores. And they're talking about certain things about Rose McGowan, Asia Argento, Aziz Ansari, like all of it basically, they called it like they were Cassandras in the sense that they saw things before the larger culture was really ready to admit them or allow conversation. I think Nancy's point about it's not talking about this that was the problem, it's somebody wanting to hurt her is quite eloquent and also gets to the heart of what I think has been going on these past 5 to 10 years. A lot more than people really wanting some kind of sexual justice. I think that is part of it, but I think there's a huge amount of score settling and backbiting and professional jealousy. I think those layers have been underexplored in the motivations for what's been going on in the last 5 to 10 years, except maybe by, I think Megyn and Sarah Haider have talked about the idea that, is cancel culture basically perpetuated by women? And if so, why? And what is that? But I also think before we get to that point, I also just wanted to say in terms of why people listen to us, I think that we are able to talk about Me Too and its excesses, and not just its excesses, because we also talk about the importance of communication or the sacredness of sex or all sorts of things. Like, I don't think that we're agendaed on that topic. I think we come at it from a lot of thought and a lot of experience, and as two middle-aged women who love sex, but also have seen a few things over the years, and I think we're able to have conversations that are honest and intellectually rigorous and not afraid. Like, I'm never afraid to have those conversations. And I think that's something that as women, we can do in a way that I don't hear men able to do.
Broadly, it seems like men and women discuss these issues in different ways, perhaps because of different communication styles, or also what you were saying around the boundaries that men feel around certain topics, about what they're able to talk about and not talk about. You point to an interesting phenomenon, which is the differences in how men and women punish or exact revenge on each other. And it's kind of a classic trope in that men are, traditionally bigger and stronger, so they just use out and out violence to get what they want. But I mean, the Salem witch trials were driven by women, specifically young girls, right? In order to get revenge on other women or other girls within that society who they basically had a vendetta against. And there is a Salem witch trial element to what happens with a lot of these social movements. I mean, to add a little bit of context about what specifically happened to you in 2018 and your husband's business, to quote from an interview that you and Leah did with Nick Gillespie on the Reason podcast, you said there was a former employee of your husband's Portland coffee business that found your YouTube series, Nancy, and wrote a letter to the staff saying your, quote, wild, dangerous, and grossly misguided YouTube series, this is you talking, Nancy, created an unsafe work environment, end quote, for the coffee shop employees, and that it was, quote, her job to get some signatures and take it to the media, end quote. And you described it as an old-fashioned, disgruntled former employee using the modern tools of outrage culture. So my question to both of you, and we could start with you, Nancy, is this seems to happen with all social movements, right? Like, there's an issue in society that needs addressing, and addressing that is probably long overdue, whether it's around, race, sex, criminal justice reform, something along those lines. And it boils up and it explodes. And a lot of good, hopefully, is done. But while actual social change is happening, there are also, and always, people who use these movements for their own personal gain or petty grievances under the cover of the movement. How do we go about identifying one from the other?
Well, I guess it's sort of up, the public does that. And it really depends on where the culture is at that moment. When this happened to my husband and me in early 2019, the press in Portland could not have been hungrier for a story like this. I've said before, if this had been New York City, I don't think anything really would have happened. But we were big fish in a small pond. And even though my husband had done absolutely nothing wrong, it was a known target. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to address my dry cleaner that no one's ever heard of. And I think it conferred a certain status on the person that did this, which I think was satisfying to her. I think we go through periods of what we are going to be receptive to. Like right now, again, like if this had happened today, in Portland, I don't think it would get the same traction. I'm not exactly sure what would get traction for like what we would all, I'm leaving myself out of this. I don't join mobs. I hope I don't, at least. I really don't know how to answer that question, I guess. I guess it's up to the person who feels that they are going to add their little like or their little thumbs down or their little bad Yelp review or whatever it is, because it makes them feel something inside. It makes them feel that they're the good people. It makes them feel that they're part of a wave of something that's going to do good. Maybe it's completely unexplored to them. I think there are a lot of people too who don't want to be left out, or they want to be seen as allies. I don't know. What do you think, Sarah? I'm being uneloquent here.
Well, and if I could add a little piece of it, maybe attack it a different way as we hand it off to you, Sarah. We'll never be able to figure out why people do what they do, what drives them and their motivations to ride the wave of a social movement for their own personal gain. But I guess the better question is, why has it become impossible to talk about that, to talk about how, hey, I don't actually think this person who is trying to get me canceled actually cares about this social movement they purport to care about? I think they're faking it. How do we have those conversations where we can call out the bad actors while still saying the movement broadly is good?
Well, first of all, I don't think that these conversations we shouldn't be having them on social media. I mean, I think those are mediums that are really profound in the way that they connect us to each other, but their limitations are also profound. I think that we forget that we're living inside of a social experiment sometimes. Social media has been around so long that it's like even complaining about Facebook scams or people faking their lives on Instagram or trolling other people on Twitter. It's such old news. But what you don't realize is that it's actually part of the kind of time capsule social experiment that we're living in, that I think ultimately when we look back 5-10 years into the future, I don't know what it's going to look like, worse or better, but I think it's going to be a lot of like, oh God, I can't believe we all did that. Because that's how you feel about everything. Like, I can't believe, we all wrote on Facebook, like, status update, I'm getting food right now, and that was 10 years ago. And everything has changed and morphed. I think we'll look back with clearer eyes and we'll be able to see things like that. But no, we can't see that in the moment. And I guess what I wish is that it would sink into people that we don't need to adjudicate these things in public, that it's not worthwhile. I would like people to move away from joining on to those mobs, into those mobs. I think they are in a certain way. I don't see them as much, but it's certainly true that social media, from the Me Too standpoint, it was always really difficult for women to get criminal charges filed against anybody that had done them wrong. There's multiple reasons for this. One of them is the criminal justice system, and one of them is the kind of squishy gray zone area of he said, she said. And also inside of that, there's all these things like, I perceived it this way, he perceived it that way. There's just huge problems with trying to adjudicate that in court. And social media gave us this really clear workaround. It was just like, you can post something from your own perspective. It's not the story, it's your story. And nobody can argue with you. And it throws up a force field. And, I think for a long time, people felt like, okay, we need to come to this person's side. And then you have enough personal examples of like, oh, I don't know about that one. And this one seemed a little bit weird. And then you get enough legal issues working through the court because there's so many men that got kicked out of colleges or, fired from their jobs. And you start to have a larger awareness that maybe we shouldn't be doing it this way. And I hear, away from social media, I hear people talk about that more. But, to your question, which is how can we know what's in someone's heart? We never will.
But I think that we can know if someone has come to the court of Twitter to get a personal grievance decided. I think our little spidey sense should go off and say, why has this person gone to the court of Twitter? Why is he or she doing this? Because that is asking for something. That's asking for our sympathies. It's asking for our attention. And I think if you drill down to most problems, that's not really this sort of grown-up way and honest way to do things. You have a bad hamburger at a restaurant. You could go up and say to the owner, gosh, this burger's really bad. I really didn't like it. Or you could go home and you could tweet about it and put it on Yelp and destroy his life, which is what people do. Why are they doing that? They're doing that for some sort of, it's not just about the hamburger. It's about them getting some sort of attention as, the hamburger avenger or whatever it is. And so I think we should always be highly suspect when someone is asking for us to fight a battle on their behalf.
One thing I've noticed, and there is a lot of overlap in how each of you write, but if I was going to try and differentiate between what each of you write about, I would say more often than not, Sarah, you seem to mine your own personal history. And Nancy, it's not that you don't do that, but you also do mine the history of other people and try and figure out why other people do what they do, whether it's classically sympathetic figure John Wayne Gacy or Amanda Stott Smith, who in 2009 drove to the middle of Selwood Bridge in Portland, Oregon, and dropped her 2 children into the Willamette River. And then 40 minutes later, rescuers found the body of 4-year-old Eldon and his 7-year-old sister, Trinity, who was alive, and Eldon had died. In a recent short essay on your Substack, Make More Pie, you recall a discussion you had with actor Michael Cherniss, who will be playing serial killer John Wayne Gacy in an upcoming television series for NBC's Peacock streaming service. In that conversation, you say, quote, "I told him then of a dream I had as I was finishing up To the Bridge, a true story of motherhood and murder. I was in a kindergarten room. At a table was Eldon, the murdered 4-year-old I had been writing about. I sat on a little chair next to him and asked if he could write his name for me. He did and handed me the paper in a way that I knew meant remember me," end quote. And excuse me, I'm not sure why I'm even getting emotional at that, but
because I am.
Sarah, in your writing in your first autobiography, Blackout, and in the book that you're currently writing, which I also want to discuss with you, We've talked about how it can be really difficult to kind of go into your own life and kind of dig up and arrange and write about darker, messier, less flattering parts of your own story and airing them for the public to see. But I guess I just want to know, Nancy, like, what draws you to these stories of horror and heartbreak and trauma? And also, how do you sustain yourself as you are visited by the ghosts of these people you're writing about? What draws you to it and what keeps you going?
Well, thank you for the question, because you're talking about some of the stories that mean the most to me, as I call them, the stories I'm taking in the coffin with me. Many of my stories, I think my best stories, are when they have been reported by the press in one way, and I look at it and I say, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, this isn't adding up. And that happens a lot because, let's say you're a daily reporter for the Oregonian, woman drops kids off bridge. You have to get the story in the next day. Oh my God, the public reacts. And it's like, she's crazy or she's evil, and that's it. Close the door. And I'm like, that didn't answer the question for me. I had to sort of try to find out. And the way I found out, just an incredibly long time to get people to talk to me and to try to understand, different motivations and look at this sort of prismatic situation and then write it. Eldon didn't come to me. I was like 5 years into writing the book when this happened. So it's not that you're looking at a traumatic situation and, living that trauma every day. I had a story that published a couple of months ago about a man in Georgia who committed suicide. He was a pastor and he was a mayor of a small town, and his life story was taken over by his name was Bubba Copeland, was taken over by the mainstream media as, cross-dresser, exposed, this is why we have to be careful with LGBTQ people and da, 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 da. And people from his small town got in touch with me and said, that's not the story. And they didn't like someone that they knew and loved being used sort of as an example by the press. People need to write quickly, or they're just not thoughtful, or they've got a drum they want to bang. And I thought it was important to go down and spend some time and understand more about this person's life. And that's, I think, another example of, Bubba Copeland could have just been like this token person that whatever the Daily Beast used to prove a point. Or we could learn more about him. Like, we can know him because, the story's right there. And you just have to spend some time and take it by the hand. And then this person can be introduced to the rest of the world. I think maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe these people wouldn't want that. I was certainly told that when I was writing To the Bridge, that I shouldn't be writing this book, that it was going to hurt people. I thought it was important to know a fuller story, to not make people just characters in a simple story that you tell yourself. And why I write these stories is because I just have to. I hear about something, and as my husband used to say, there she goes. It's like, I just have to find out more. I hope, if I'm lucky, that I can have many more of these stories come my way and spend some time on them, because it's really what I want to do and what I hope that I'm best at.
You really put a fine point on what I think is a binding tissue between what drives you both respectively in your writing, and I suppose to speak out on this podcast, which is, I feel like you're both drawn to that gap that exists between how something is being discussed in public and what you yourself either learn or know to be true about that subject. That seems to be something that animates both of you.
Yes.
Yeah, I totally, I've always known that what I could do as a writer was to tell the truth about things that people mostly lied about. And it's not like I'm so special. Like I said, I was raised by a therapist that told me it was fine to tell her what you really thought. So I just feel like I was groomed for this. But I think that's what literature does, is it collapses the space between what people are saying in society and what's actually going on underneath the skin. And I think my area of expertise is using my own life as material. I think Nancy's area of expertise is being able to take those tools and apply them to somebody else's life. But I think that our writing has a lot in common. I think one of the reasons I was comfortable doing a podcast with her, it's weird, I've never really thought about this before, but like when I first started reading her writing, it reminded me more of my own writing than pretty much anybody else's, except for maybe a couple of other people that I know. That's really unusual.
Yeah.
We have a very similar taste in writing. I think we love small stories that speak to large universal truths. It just happens that she has the ability to do that while talking to people she's just met. And if you meet Nancy, you might understand why this is, because you don't know if it's growing up in New York or I don't know what it is, but it's like she's never met a stranger. you walk down the street with her and she knows this person and like, how's that person going over there? Like, I lived in New York for 6 years and I just walked around in silence, like crying, like I didn't say hi to anybody and she knows everybody. People feel heard and seen by her. And whether you're turning the lens inward or you're turning it outward, hopefully at some point you will do both of those things. Like, I think one of the reasons that Nancy's profiles work is that they have an element of self-reflection. There's usually a moment where she's talking about something going on in her life or she compares it. And I am a lot of me, but I am always keeping an eye on the culture. There's usually a moment where I'm going to zoom out and show you how this links in, this story, this very specific personal story that I'm telling links in with the broader cultural trend that I'm trying to mine some gold from. So we write about different things, but we're actually really similar writers. And I think it's what we do on our podcast too. Yeah, I think that's really smart of you, Michael, to identify that difference between us and also make the parallel to what we do on Smoke 'Em, because I think that's where we find the juice.
A little glimpse into how I prep for these conversations, especially in instances where I'm going to be talking to two people, let alone one, is, I'll pull up some of Nancy's essays, some of yours, listen to some podcasts. But there was something else from that short essay from your Substack, Nancy, that you wrote that reminded me of something that Sarah wrote, which reminded me of something that Megan Down wrote. So
yes,
give me about 90 seconds here and I can get through all of it. And then I'll turn it back to you.
Sure.
Nancy, you wrote, quote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live," Didion famously said, Joan Didion. "Maybe my thinking Eldon charged me with telling his story, or that 33 dead boys now look to Michael Chernus to tell theirs, is a narrative conceit, the writer's way of organizing the world, but I don't see a better reason to do the work we do," end quote. And that took me to, Sarah, the introduction to your 2015 autobiography, Blackout, in which you write, quote, "I wrote stories about my drinking. Some were fiction and some were painfully true. And I liked that my snappy comic tone made it hard to tell which was which," end quote. And I wanted to tie this to something I recently spoke about with Megan Down. It was one of her recent essays, which was titled, "Was Alice Munro an Art Monster?" in which Megan writes, quote, "Sometimes the more a writer understands her characters, the less she understands herself. The brutal honesty she deploys on the page is often cover for a life off the page that she can scarcely bring herself to look at. Believe it or not, this might be doubly true for first-person writing, by which I mean memoir and personal essay. We can lay ourselves bare on the page while keeping our actual selves in a protective shell. We can practice radical honesty in our work, or at least purport to, while keeping the real world at arm's length. We can run our worst characteristics through a filter of dazzling prose and come out with something resembling wisdom and redemption. Readers might even fall for it, but deep down, even not so deep down, we'll know it's a ruse," end quote. As people who write about and mine your own lives, do you agree with this assessment of what writers do, especially when they're speaking about their own histories? And Sarah, we can start with you.
Well, the Megan quote is super interesting and I love it. And it reminds me of one of the reasons I love reading Megan is that she's about as good as it gets in terms of our personal essay writers, both about the subject and writing stories herself. Before I was friends with her, I was a great admirer of her work. And all of us are either pointing back to or greatly influenced by Joan Didion. I'm reminded of two things at once. One of them is that I once dated this total asshole that told me that personal writing was just like a fake catharsis for feeling like you had solved a problem when you really hadn't. And I stopped dating him, but I think he was kind of correct. I don't think it's just that. In the same way that I think true crime is a catharsis for feeling like you've solved a case when you often haven't. How many of those true crime podcasts are like 10 hours and then they're like, we still don't know.
He's still out there. Yeah.
And so what I would say is that I don't think the work of memoir is really about a catharsis or an exposure of who you are entirely. It's usually like just the intimate unfolding and working through of a particular moment in time while other people come along on the ride for you. That said, I think that just like any other genre, there are worse and better practitioners. Megan's one of the better ones. I think I'm one of the better ones, but there's a lot of lousy memoir writers out there. It is one of the easiest genres to kind of come into cold without any kind of skills as a writer. You're just sort of like, this was my life. And I think most memoirs that I read strike me as phony. I actually don't read that many memoirs for that reason. There's only a few, but the ones that I love, I would put Megan in this category. Carolyn Knapp's Drinking a Love Story. Danny Shapiro does good memoirs. Leslie Jameson. But it's amazing to me what you can expose and still not tell. And so I guess the other thing that it reminded me of was when I did Blackout and I would do a lot of events. Blackout is a story about my drinking life. I would go and do events and people would say to me afterwards, well, you just put it all out there. You didn't leave anything on the table. And I'm thinking like, oh God, you don't even know. Like there's this thing that I haven't told you. There's this thing that I kept to myself. I never talked about the abortion. And it's a weird thing. Like I am writing about it for my second book. And now I'm like, okay, will readers of Blackout feel cheated that I didn't tell them I had an abortion? But during that chapter, it felt too heavy for that chapter to hold. There's an enormous amount of artistry that's going on in the creation of a memoir. It's not just like a chronology. And in fact, the way that you make a book pretty lousy is to make it a chronology instead of artfully choosing details. So, there's always something that I'm keeping to myself. I mean, I think it's a little bit like the mystery of the human soul. I can know somebody as well as anybody else can know them, but there's still going to be things about them that are mysterious that I'll never be able to crack,
Yeah, but that's the tricky thing. And I think it can apply to both of your styles of writing, which is that whether you're writing about yourself or about someone else's story, that word authenticity is slippery, right? Because you don't want someone to lie, but also you don't want someone to be purely authentic in the way that we would kind of imagine it, which is your friend just kind of rambling incoherently at you all the thoughts that are coming to their head all the time, or to contain everything in the story exactly as it happened. Because in the way that our bodies are like 80% water, our lives are kind of like 80 to 90% boring. If you're telling the story about your divorce, do you need to include what you ate for lunch on June 13th, even though that's more authentic, right? When you're trying to say something true, but you understand that you have to excise certain things that actually did happen in your pursuit of a larger truth that you can only achieve through the artifice of construction, how do you walk that line where you're being true to the story and potentially the victims in the story, while also realizing that the process of writing is removing?
It's always in the way you tell the story. The analogy I use sometimes is it's like a house. Okay, I'm going to give you a tour of my house. So am I going to walk you through the palatial front door? Am I going to sneak you into the window in the basement? Are we going to go at night? Are we going to take a ladder up to, you have to figure out how you're going to lead the reader through this story. And that takes a long time because you have to understand how you want to tell the story. I can tell you, I have 11 banker's boxes full of research for To the Bridge, which I believe is a 282-page book. The way you learn this is you write a lot of stuff and you don't use it. You look at it and you're like, you know what? This was a really interesting chapter, or this was a really interesting facet, I thought, of this person, but I don't need it. Now, you don't put it in the incinerator. And then maybe later on, I remember I took a long time to write my book and I had this one little, called it like a little scrap pile. And I just threw about 20 or 30 little things in there, things that I thought were sort of scintillating or starry. And I wished I could find a place, but I just couldn't as I was going through it. And then at the very end, I went through and looked at it and it turned out I could use almost all of them, but now I knew where they went. But that just took a long time of removing. My late stepfather, David Levine, was a painter and a caricaturist, and he always said it's about taking things away. It's not about adding. Now, the baby writers don't know that. Every writer, when they're young, if they're lucky, will have an editor that says to them, we don't need that part. And then the writer says, but it happened like that. The editor doesn't fucking care if it happened. It doesn't belong in the story. And that's just something that you learn. And I guess you could call that authenticity. I guess you also could just call it getting down to the essence of how you want to tell the story. Doesn't mean it would be the way Sarah tells the story, the way Michael tells the story, the way Didion tells the story. But it's what you, after a long time or sometimes a short period of time, you can give the story as much as you believe that it can hold.
Sarah, you've been working on your second book, Unattached, I think for about 4 years now. It's your second memoir. You've at times described it, to pull a few different quotes, being in my 40s and not having kids and not being married, or what were my choices, what were not my choices, what was the way culture was moving me in that direction. Also, this is about the life that I thought I was going to have versus the life that I ended up living. My question to you is, to go to the metaphor that Nancy just used, has part of what has been the, I suppose, writerly frustration of the book been figuring out how you were going to tour the house? how you were going to let us in, what rooms you were going to show us?
Yeah, absolutely. Because most of this book takes place after Blackout, which now has been a robust 10 years, which is amazing to me. That time flew. But it was also dipping back into my past. And, also when you're writing a second memoir, it's like, how much of the first story do I retell? Okay, we know you're a drunk. We'll just cut out those passages. Or
on the previous episode of Sarah Hepola's life.
Yeah. I mean, it was confusing to me. And my agent and editor kept telling me, like, you're going to need to remind people, like, basically, nobody remembers your first book. Talk to us like we're new. And I'm like, I know, but I said this earlier. And it was definitely how to build the house. And also for me, it was what house I was trying to build. I mean, like, I'm a planner in real life. I know what I'm going to do all throughout the day. But like when it comes to writing, I just kind of sit down with an idea or a feeling and I see where it leads. It feels like a thread that I'm tugging. And for whatever reason, I'm able to do that in a personal essay form pretty easily and neatly. And so I'm used to like sitting down one morning and finishing it up by 2:00 and then polishing it the next day. But with a book, you can't just do 90 of those in a row.
No.
You have to have a much larger vision. And for me, I had to write a lot more of it to see that that wasn't where I wanted to go. So I don't have an actual scrap pile like Nancy's talking about. But I mean, I know that I've written millions of words. That's not a hyperbole, like millions of words, in order to try to figure out the 100,000 that made its way to my editor's inbox 2 weeks ago when I turned in the latest draft. And I don't know how many times I'm going to write it again. I mean,
can I just ask a question on that?
Yeah.
When you say you've written millions of words trying to write about your own life and throw away millions of words to get to that 100,000 that you know is going to be actually in the book, how does that not just completely drain you? How do you not feel just such a weight? Like, I just know, like, if I'm talking one-on-one with a friend about something deeply personal and I have to go there, just that hour-long conversation, I go home and I just feel like my soul has been removed from my body and I have to scoop it back in. Like, the idea of doing that through millions of words only to discard them and have to do it again, how do you keep yourself full? Like, how do you fill yourself back up to do it again?
Well, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think first of all, I'm very invigorated by the act of writing. Like, normally when I sit down to write a book, there's a question I'm trying to figure out for myself that I need to figure out whether or not I'm writing a book about it or not. And for this one, it was around my singlehood and not having children. And this key question of like, did I choose that or did it happen to me? In other words, there were certain things that I did that felt like choices that were moving in a certain direction. And then I had a different outcome. What responsibility is this in my life? And also, like, how much of our life do we actually shape? So those are the things I'm looking at. So, as I'm wandering down various corridors of this mansion, which is my house book, mansion in size, not necessarily in value, I'm getting things out of it. I like this experience. If I didn't, I'm in the wrong job.
So it's not draining to you in that way?
No, there are parts of it that are draining, but not in the beginning. In the beginning, it's very invigorating. I really love it. I want to discover. I'm creating new worlds. I'm playing. I mean, I'm a child of imagination and fantasy, and I'm creating all of that. So it's very, very fun. And I feel like I get this like manic high where I'm like, I'm going to win the Pulitzer Prize. Everyone's going to know I'm a genius. Like, this is going to be amazing for me. And it's a very, very fun high that I really love. And it's especially easy to keep that high when you don't have to show anybody the work necessarily. Somebody can be like, how's the writing? And I was like, it was kick-ass. And there's no editor on the other side being like, what's this about? So I can enjoy that high. Then I think the problem is when you do give it over to somebody and they're like, yeah, this isn't right, or this isn't it. And it knocks me down. And I've now had that experience 4 times where I turned the book in 4 different times. And my editor was like, this isn't quite right. And what I would say is that I have to come back to how lucky I am to do what I do. That a lot of people would like to have a book sold on proposal that they have to turn in. They would love to have an editor that's like, we really want to make this book big, so you need to really nail it. And so you have to go back to the drawing board. I think it's a privilege to be able to write a book. I think it's a really insane thing to ask people to spend 7 or 8 or 10 hours of their life reading about your life. So you damn better bring the goods.
Earn it. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to earn it. And we live in a time when confession is so cheap. the details of people's lives are just everywhere. I mean, whether it's vlogs or TikTok, or we're flooded with first person. So I feel like that is incumbent upon me to give people an experience that they could not get anywhere else, that we're going to go so deeply under the skin, and it's going to be so precise and so fun and funny that you're going to feel like you lived by reading this book. And that's a really, really hard thing to do. It's not something that you can do on your first draft, nor should you expect to. So I think when I speak to writers that I admire and whose work I really admire, what they will tell you is it takes a lot more drafts to get here than I think the reader assumes.
Speaking of the relationship between audience and author or creative, and who listens or watches or pays for that, Nancy, you have a Substack, Make More Pie. Obviously, the two of you also have the Substack for the podcast, and you get revenue that way. But we live in this very singular and peculiar time, like this brief period that is less than 20 years old, but I guess is now our new and future present, where there are these kinds of social connections that are possible that never were before. Like, Sarah, you've described Emily Nussbaum as more of a Twitter friend, which is just such a very specific moment in time way to describe someone because it's so new, right? But these abilities to make these social connections online allow these new potential revenue streams, new ways to make a living for creative people like yourselves. But this ability to make these direct connections with people around the world, it can create this parasocial dynamic that wasn't really a thing until 5 minutes ago. As someone who has a Substack, Nancy, as someone who's directly connected now to your readers in a way that you weren't in the 90s or 2000s, what does that feel like? And what is that like as a writer?
Most of the time, it's just neutral or fine. You sometimes develop relationships with people. Sometimes they lead to working relationships. Hello, we're sitting here together. Occasionally, you will become kind of friendly with one of your Twitter followers or your Substack readers. I'm working on a project right now with someone who is a fan of, I met him through the Fifth Column. I've actually never met him in real life. He's a big fan of Smoke'em, and now we're doing some work together on a book. And that's really, really interesting. It can sometimes be a little uncomfortable. I think Sarah's probably had the same situation where you get someone who can get a little obsessed, not obsessed with you so much that you're scared it's going to be some sort of Glenn Close situation, but they feel that they know you or that you're actually having a relationship with them when you're not. And in those cases, I'm thinking of one person in particular on one of the social media platforms. I just wound up having to mute this person because every day there's several different messages and I don't know this person. Frankly, I don't want to know this person, but you also don't want to block them because then they believe they're in more of a relationship with you.
Right.
I find being able to write and get it out there quickly. I wrote a piece about Kamala Harris yesterday that seemed to have some resonance with several thousand people. That's really amazing to be able to just sit down. And I spent the day, baking a banana bread and writing an essay and boom, putting it up there. And it's great. I mean, having written a piece that you like, and then, you don't know what's going to happen to it. Maybe it doesn't go anywhere. It's like you drop a pebble in a pot and bloop, you never see it again. But then when it does have some resonance with people and you could just do that, it's really a fantastic feeling. And it leads to the next project, even if the next project is just that it puts some gas in your tank to write the next essay. So I love the new world. I love the new world of being able to publish, to being able to create. I mean, Sarah and I created this podcast out of nothing, just out of nothing. And here we are with you and communicate with, I don't know how many thousand people a week. And it's great.
I think that there is certainly a downside to this. I hear this term parasocial relationships, and I've had weird encounters mostly back in the blog days. I had a personal blog starting in 2001. And so I've been writing about my life online for, gosh, what is that? Almost 25 years now. And so I had more uncomfortable interactions with people in the first 10 years before I knew to have better boundaries. I have not had this experience in the last 10 years, even with the book coming out. Talk about 99 to 1. I have had so many amazing interactions from people telling me about their lives in a way that's meaningful to people giving me the greatest book, restaurant, other podcast recommendation. I mean, it's just amazing. And I feel like once a month, Nancy and I have a Zoom chat with our paid subscribers. And, it's grown from whoever was going to come on the first one, where I was like, Nancy, what if it's just one person? And, it was 10 or whatever. Now it's, 30 or 40 people. And we're like, we're looking at each other like, who are these people? You know, like, this is so cool. And then we meet them, and I could be fooling myself because I'll fall into some pitfall of parasocial hell in the next year. But to be honest with you, I find it so much more satisfying than back in the day when your readers just like, you never knew them or heard from them. There's been this intermediate step for me. Like back in the 90s, you never heard from people. You wrote and it really did drop into a pond. Maybe you heard something or not. And then there was this intermediate step of like, they've opened up comments and everybody thinks you suck. That was hellish. Like, I hated that. It was like, oh my God, I've been laboring under the delusion that everybody loved me. And now it turns out that like everybody hates me. Of course, none of this is true. It's always in the middle. But now I feel like I'm to a point where like I'm having genuine exchanges with people and it feels really edifying. It feels really educational. Part of it is that I've grown up. I've gotten more comfortable. I don't care if somebody tells me I wrote drivel. Yeah, whatever. That's fine. But it also feels like, what are we doing here as writers? Okay. Are we here just to broadcast into the black void? And maybe you like it and maybe you don't, but we got to use our voices? Or are we actually trying to, what's the project about? For me, it's always been about trying to make sure people know that they're not alone and that whatever they've been through, somebody else has too. Maybe it's not me, but it's somebody else. That's what's interesting to me. I also like sentences and I like meeting people and I'm a curious person, but at the end of the day, it's about connecting. And this is a way of knowing that I've done that.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. And thank you both so much for your time. Thank you for your writing and thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you for having us back. This is fun to do it together.
Absolutely. Michael, your questions are always so thoughtful and it was really fun to have my girl with me, riding with me.